Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Platforms and Pandemics, our cheerfully titled retrospective on the Democratic National Convention. We'll be doing another one of these after the Republican Convention. And it's my great pleasure to be kicking around this subject with our distinguished panel. Osita Nwanevu is a staff writer for the New Republic, as is Walter Shapiro, who is now in the process of covering its, I believe, your 11th presidential campaign, and Liz Goodwin from the Boston Globe. So welcome, everyone. And I think this is a good time to be taking stock of last week's proceedings at the DNC on the eve of the Republican National Convention. This is sort of the interval where the Democratic Party is, I think, I haven't actually checked the polls, but I'm assuming there has been a post-convention bounce, even though obviously this convention was not broadcast in the way that conventions usually are. We then will move into the RNC's fiercely, I think, it's safe to say, fiercely anti-democratic messaging. So I guess my first question for the panel is, what do we make of the democratic messaging? I think I have sort of characterized it in our edit meetings here as kind of very much a Manichaean character study, where bad man over there in the Republican White House and good man here in the person of Joe Biden. I was reminded, I guess, of long ago, George H.W. Bush blurted out a prompt to himself in a speech that read, "Message, I care." And I think that was a pretty economical summary of what the DNC adopted as its overriding message for 2020. I guess the question is that going to be enough? And is, the kind of also the traditional pivoting of the party to the general electorate, bringing in a lot of Republican speakers to, they hope enlist disenchanted Republican and independent voters. Is that strategic part of the messaging likely to work in what's almost certain to be an intensely polarized general election campaign? Walter, since you have a wealth of experience in these matters, I figured I would put it to you first.
Okay, that means a wealth of historical examples that don't apply to 2020.
That is true. I was saying in another meeting earlier today, I read a certain New York Times article saying 1988 could be the model for Trump's comeback, and I almost physically threw it across the room.
I mean, that this is sui generis. I mean, a perfect example. I don't know if Osita and Liz had a different experience, but I had the damnedest time getting a floor pass for the major speeches for the Democratic Convention.
Right.
But serious point, a convention only has two roles. If there is not a nominee, it is to make the decision on behalf of the Democratic voters as to who the president and vice president are. In the modern terms, it only has one role, which is to win votes for the general election. Right. And by that standard, I thought the Democratic Convention was quite successful. To my mind, I wish there were more substance. I wish there were fewer testimonials to Joe Biden as a caring human being who is going to give out his cell phone number to 330 million Americans and spend 10 minutes a day talking to each of them. But so far, the Democrats have done a very good job of resisting ways to run outside the pandemic. That looking back on it, and I've talked to Biden insiders, the amount of pressure they were under from Democratic office holders and big Democrats in March, April, and May to get Biden out of his basement and do conventional, figure out a way of doing conventional campaign events. But they were the Biden campaign was totally right, because what happened is those were great months for Joe Biden, illustrating the general rule in politics: if your opponent is self-destructing, don't get in the way.
How about you, Osita? You've had, many past criticisms of Democratic feints to the center and the right, and in part, this is, as Walter is saying, this is just what a national convention exists to do. But I, sort of going back to the end of my question, is that messaging likely to work in a political climate like the one we now live in?
Well, it's complicated, as Walter has said. This is an election unlike any other election in recent memory. And it's an election where Biden went into the convention doing pretty damn well. I mean, I think that the averages have him, I think, between 8 and 10 points ahead of Trump. This is a terrible economic and public health situation for Donald Trump. There was polling, I think, midsummer, I think even as recently as a couple of weeks before the convention, showing that Biden was ahead with voters over 65, which just hasn't happened for a Democratic candidate in a very, very long time. And if that's holds true through November, and this could well be the thing, or one of the things that puts him well over the top. But given all that, there's still a lot of uncertainty. There's still a lot of time left between now and the election. And what I saw in the convention seemed familiar to me. It seemed like the message that Democrats went with in 2016. They were focused on Trump's character. They were focused on questions of decency, his unfitness for the role, not so much on policy. Now, 2016 was a very different election. That's a message that might resonate now, or you can also say that the message Democrats go with now doesn't really matter given all of the sort of external factors and conditions. But honestly, I felt a little bit anxious leaving the convention, more so than I went in, precisely because it was the message that Democrats tried in 2016, and it was a message that didn't work for them then. And I think the main issue isn't so much winning votes in the aggregate, but winning votes in the constituencies and the places that matter. Right. After the 2016 election, there was a lot of concern about specifically what Democrats were going to do to appeal to the white working class. The first State of the Union address the Democrats went with after Trump's election was Steve Bashir. By the end of things, you have people like Stacey Abrams, people who the party is putting forward, because there's been a change in the party's consciousness, I think, or a change in their understanding of what they need to do to prevail electorally, I think, partially as a product of the 2018 midterms, where Democrats won back the House on the basis of a lot of support from moderates, a lot of suburbanites they managed to convert. The issue, though, is that the House and congressional elections are different from presidential elections. Some of those gains that they made in 2018 were in my home state of Virginia, places that had been trending Democratic for a while, but they finally went over the top in certain House races. But Virginia has been in the Democratic column for presidential elections for some time now. All of those seats that they won in Orange County, California, by turning moderate Republicans over in those places and winning suburbanites, won't matter at all in the Electoral College. California is a Democratic state.
Right.
So I think I wonder about the extent to which Democrats have been allowed by the results of the 2018 midterms and some of the anxieties that you're seeing among suburbanites about Trump. I wonder if that has sort of taken their eye off the ball of what needs to happen in places in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, where the election last time around was actually decided by these exurban, white working class, Obama to Trump voters, and also this drop-off in African-American turnout in urban areas.
Right.
That's a concern for me. It's possible, again, that none of this really matters given the coronavirus and given everything else that's putting Biden so well ahead. But, if the coronavirus were not happening and this were the campaign Democrats were running, I'd be concerned.
Yes, I had similar sort of sense memories of 2016 with a big kind of push to project not only compassion, but competence, the reassurance that, without without specifying exactly what's going to happen at the policy level, but we'll wrap our arms around the coronavirus challenge. We'll make progress toward something like, substantive progress on climate change, some sort of, talk at least of addressing the plague of inequality. But Liz, what's your read? Especially, your home paper is just randomly home to, we expect a lot of dissension on the Democratic side of things, and there wasn't in the convention, but the Markey Kennedy race, I think in many ways has attracted a lot of focus of these activist energies and this battle for the party's soul. And, how do you see, party leaders, again, just getting everyone in line and discipline behind what is, at least to my ear, a pretty vague message?
At the convention?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was also struck, like Osita was saying, about sort of running on the character differences, because that was a huge theme of 2016, and it didn't work then, as he was pointing out. And even though like Hillary Clinton's unfavorables were in a much worse spot than Biden, when you asked voters like, who cares more about people like me, which is like this very standard polling question they ask in every presidential, Hillary was always beating out Donald Trump on that, even till the bitter end. More voters thought she cared about regular people than Trump did. But there was like this appetite at the same time for someone who was going to change things, yada, yada. And a lot of people who, broke for Trump didn't do so because they thought he had a great character. That was not some like misconception that was out there in the populace. So I definitely, I'm kind of surprised in a way to see them doubling down on that with the testimonials from the kids and the grandkids, and Kamala Harris had the same thing. It makes more sense with her because they're introducing her. Right. But yeah, I was surprised to see that be like almost the message from the convention in some ways. But then on the other hand, you've got to ask like, what's the alternative, right? The alternative is digging into all these differences that the party has. The alternative is asking like, tough questions that are awkward right now. And I did feel like compared to 16, which obviously was like a very raucous convention. It was like a ton of drama. You never knew what was going to happen. Like, is Hillary going to get booed? Is it like, which this convention doesn't have because it's all virtual. There's so much control that they had, which I think is actually like a huge plus for Biden, that there's not going to be any booing. There's not going to be delegates who can express their displeasure about the policy disagreements. But at the same time, I did feel like there was an undercurrent of anxiety that you could kind of feel even with the virtual event, like the fact that the 16 rising stars, they all have like a script that they're saying, right? Like it's not like you get to hear from 16 different people about what they think the party should do, even though obviously these speeches have to be approved and all that. There's still more room for like organic disagreements or visions to be competing, and you got this sense with this convention, or I did at least at times, that it was just so scripted, so there was no room for any of that to peek through.
No, it's certainly true, and it does sort of compound the, I mean, on the one hand, as Osita was referencing, none of this may matter if Biden's polling leads hold, particularly in swing states, and the decision to downplay or backpedal policy disagreements is, perhaps tactically wise if, airing them is going to create dissension and division and cut into your lead. I understand that, but at the same time, and I'm glad you mentioned the sort of younger party leaders, because the other, and I say this as an old person myself, but the overriding, kind of cumulative effect of the messaging of the convention for me was like, this party is kind of afraid of its younger voices. They gave AOC like 90 seconds, and they didn't give anyone else in the squad a platform at all. And Bernie Sanders, was of course produced, first night to sort of, make peace as the chief rival to Biden, but even that was very, he was filmed in front of an enormous stack of firewood and just seemed like an old, sort of homesteader or something. For a party that, historically has been associated with, quote, new ideas and the liberal mandate to sort of confront new challenges and circumstances, the event read in a stylistic and, in terms of choice of speakers, as a very conservative kind of, both the messaging I think was conservative, like trust us, we know what we're doing, and the kind of face of the party felt very establishment to me. I'm wondering if other people had that same impression.
Okay, can I come to, I don't mean to be an apologist for the Biden campaign, but let me take the contrarian view,
sure.
Which is, number one, that I thought if anyone thought that the Democratic diversity, including the diversity of young people, was not on display at this convention, I think they were watching something that I didn't see.
Right.
Number two, there was a real television problem of having no confidence in voters' ability to absorb any message over 4 minutes. That only about 6 or 7 people over 4 days spoke for more than 4 or 5 minutes. So the fact is that all sorts of ideas didn't get expressed because it's hard to set them up. I was thinking, I hated the 17-person keynote address. And if Barack Obama had been one of 17 people delivering a keynote address in 2004, one would not have remembered a moment of it. I cannot right now remember a moment of the 17 people. I can remember everything from the roll call. And I will never go to Rhode Island without thinking about calamari again. But the serious point is, going back to Osita's point about learning the wrong lessons from 2018. The fact is that there were 2 elements that I think are important. I do think that combination of the choice of Kamala Harris, a proud alumna of Howard University, combined with all the people of color on display in this convention, combined with 4 years of Donald Trump, if that is not enough to increase African-American turnout in places like Detroit, Philadelphia, et cetera, to 2012 levels, I don't know what more the Democrats could have done. And again, going back to those 3 key states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, they all have suburban constituencies. And one of the things that always I thought was a symbol of Hillary losing Pennsylvania by, I believe, 10,000 votes was that she did no better in the collar counties around Philadelphia, the Bucks, the Montgomery counties, than Barack Obama did in 2012. Barack Obama was running against the ideal candidate for suburban Republicans, Mitt Romney. Hillary was running against the worst candidate for suburban Republicans, Donald Trump, and she did no better in those areas. So if you can increase that turnout, increase the turnout in Oakland County, in Michigan, and increase the Democratic vote in the WOW counties around Milwaukee, then you will have won back 3 states.
Yes, and just to be clear, I wasn't talking about the sort of representation of younger people in the convention proceedings. I was talking about the younger leaders, what Liz was referencing as the up and coming leaders of the Democratic Party. I did also want to actually, apropos of that, I was struck I did remember Barack Obama's speech at this time out, and it actually ended on a point that Osita has made repeatedly in various pieces he's written for us. Obama said, essentially addressing Black Lives Matter protesters over the summer, that they are the inheritors of the American dream, the American experiment, and that's an argument that Osita has made repeatedly, that the real momentum that often gets overlooked in our politics is mass protest. But I did, again, find it striking that, the Democratic Party wants to embrace the message of Black Lives Matter and moves, gingerly around, the sort of more disruptive elements of the protests, which again, Donald Trump, of course, has been trying to politicize and make a central part of his pitch for conservative suburban voters. But I just kind of felt, again, just an odd, it was an odd dancing around, what's been happening all summer in the streets in a lot of swing states. And Osita, I just wondered if you had a similar reaction to that moment. I think you're on mute.
Sorry. It didn't really surprise me that that there was that weirdness. I think that's sort of where the Democratic Party kind of works around these movements. I still remember Obama's reaction to Ferguson back in 2014 that people weren't really satisfied by. I think the party's moved since then and is now willing to embrace Black Lives Matter, a lot more aggressively for symbolic purposes. I don't think you're going to be seeing a lot of Democrats coming out for radical action on the police.
Right.
You're not going to hear that from the Biden campaign. That's to be expected. I mean, I think the thing that progressives have to understand is that the young progressive vote doesn't actually matter in presidential elections all that much. It's a small portion of the electorate. It's a poorly distributed portion of the electorate. Your chance at influencing the presidential election comes during the primaries, and the progressives lost. And that's just sort of it's just sort of the way it works. You saw some movement from other candidates left on certain issues. You had this Biden-Sanders unity task force. All of that is just sort of to placate progressive activists. We don't know what Biden's going to do in office. He's going to be constrained by a number of factors he doesn't really seem interested in changing. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. I've written a piece recently that argues that the actual thing that's going to drive the changes progressives want from here on out isn't really this effort to sort of look at Biden and see whether he's towing in the progressive line on this or that issue and looking at appointments and all of that. It's going to come from people applying pressure to Congress, people demonstrating, people, focusing on the pivotal legislators who are actually going to decide what comes out of Congress, because that's how the presidency works. Even if you got Biden to agree to Medicare for all through voodoo or whatever it is, it might happen. You'd still have to get it through Congress. And there aren't the votes right now. There aren't the votes to facilitate the passage of progressive legislation through eliminating the filibuster. So that's the thing. That's the stuff that progressives should be focused on and thinking about.
Well, and Biden actually has, repeatedly saying that he's ready to trash the filibuster, which on that issue, he's to the left of Bernie Sanders.
Right. I mean, I think Sanders came out for it a couple of weeks ago. I can't remember exactly. But the issue is that it ultimately is up to the pivotal legislators, people like Joe Manchin, people like Kirsten Sinema, the people who are sort of at the right edge of the caucus. They're going to be the people who put the caucus over the 50, over the 49.
The ACA.
So this is why I couldn't really get into, this question of whether AOC spoke for 60, 70, 80, 90 seconds or whatever was in the platform. Like, it doesn't matter. The actual change that people are asking for it's to happen at all, if it's to happen at all, is going to come from activism as soon as we know who has the Senate. On this question, I want to go back to something Walter said, because I think it's important. I think obviously there's suburbs everywhere, you know, and every little bit helps in every state. And there are suburban communities where you could improve upon margins in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan. I was just saying that the big tidal wave that people, it wasn't really a tidal wave, but the big shift that people saw in 2016 and that people were worried about, these Obama to Trump voters, I don't know that we saw an approach in that convention and in the Biden campaign so far that was for them as well. It seems like we have a kind of a lopsided strategy. I don't know that people who went from voting for Barack Obama to voting for Donald Trump have decency as their number one issue. You know,
Right.
The argument that the Sanders campaign made was that you could win over some of those people, not a huge number of them, but maybe some enough to put Democrats over the top with economic populism by talking about things like Medicare for all, minimum wage, and these kinds of things. We won't know whether or not that argument was right. I mean, Sanders lost. But I think that if to the extent that the party was concerned about winning some of those people back, I think that was the approach to try. The alternatives people put forward were things like, you know, the party should move right on immigration, the party should reject identity politics, things that I would have found, I think, morally unacceptable. I think that if you are concerned about that portion of the electorate, if you're concerned about the trajectory of moving further and further away from Democrats, I think that the economic stuff is what you have to go towards.
Yeah, well,
but again,
at this moment where,
yeah, but you know, again, we're in a situation where this election is crazy. Trump has had an asteroid hit his presidency. And the other thing too is that, you know, frankly, I think that a lot of those people moved from Obama to Trump on the basis of cultural grievances that a person like Joe Biden does not, you know, stoke. He's a friendly seeming, familiar seeming, avuncular white guy. That's why Obama chose him, in fact, in 2008 to allay concerns, you know. He's not running, you know, he's not a woman running against Donald Trump, etc. There are all kinds of things that make Biden a stronger candidate in those respects that might also be bolstering him. But this question of what you do with the white working class vote and how you try to appeal to them, I think is going to be a question the Democratic Party has to continue to think about, even as they make progress with moderates in the suburbs, who are also important.
Yeah, especially if, you know, as is hoped, they're able to craft or, you know, pick up a congressional majority and then put together what appears to be on hold now, a, you know, long-term governing agenda. And, you know, I mean, I think someone in the party should dare to dream at this moment and ask, well, what could a long-term governing coalition look like in the electorate? And I do think, you know, the white working class, for all the, you know, in some ways excessive ink that was spilled upon about it in the aftermath of 2016, is, you know, a riddle that the Democrats are still not adequately confronted. I'm wondering, you know, Liz, again, I mentioned the Markey Kennedy race in this connection. I do think there are still, you know, a lot of open questions about how Democrats, you know, go beyond symbolic messaging and think about, you know, if this is, you know, as everyone in this conversation, I think, is, you know, hoping to various degrees, you know, the scourge of Trumpism is put behind us. How do the Democrats put together a message that is more than "we are not Donald Trump," or that we are competent, or that we are empathetic?
Right. Yeah, it does feel like a lot of the disagreements that have to be like suppressed in the presidential race have been like popping up in the Markey Kennedy race, like in some Freudian way. But it's interesting too, because the Kennedy's main, I guess, like main reason for his run is a generational change rationale. And that's something that I think this DNC did skew pretty old. Like the speakers were among some of the oldest on average,
Right.
according to like some analysis by Axios or something. But that's also like the group that Trump is really struggling with,
Right,
is
as
older
Osita
voters.
mentioned.
I don't think anyone really knows exactly why, if it's just like COVID is affecting older people more, who knows, but this is a group he's really struggling with. And I think it's interesting that Democrats do have this very older leadership across the board. It's actually like kind of amazing how old everyone is. And this like generational change thing, I think, is an actual issue that everyone should be grappling with. But the Kennedy-Markey race is just the weirdest place for it to play out, because, you know, Markey has the support of AOC and the Sunrise Movement and all these kind of youthful avatars of change in the Democratic Party. So it's just like this weird, like Freaky Friday thing. But I am like curious about how just the generational arguments are going to play out in the future within the party. And this convention, if you were looking at it from, I don't know, outer space or something, it is kind of interesting just how, I don't know, how old the leaders are in the party.
Yeah, and even, you know, Joe Kennedy as the sort of insurgent voice of youth is kind of, you know, replicating the message of his grandfather, you know, in 1960. And
right, true. It's a very nostalgia-laden, youthful.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and,
pitch.
you know, yeah, and it's also weird that the younger candidate is the moderate, you know, more conservative one. The older one is the, you know, author of the Green New Deal, and as you said, has attracted all these activist supporters.
Can I just throw in a question to Liz here?
Sure.
The other big race on September 1st in Massachusetts is the House primary between Alex Morris and
Yes.
and Neil, the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. And actually, in policy terms, if Neil were to lose, that would probably have more to do with the governing agenda that gets through the House under Biden than anything involving Markey or Kennedy. I'm just curious, Liz, do you have any sense of how the race is going?
I don't actually. I don't think there's been a ton of good polling. I think people are pretty in the dark. The other weird thing that's been happening with primaries is in some primaries, even in COVID, like turnout is up. So people just have no idea like who's going to show up. And I don't want to be the one making predictions and being wrong about it. But I agree, that would be a huge deal. I mean, he's such a like longtime power broker, Pelosi ally. Yeah, that would be huge.
Yeah, and to sort of peer ahead to the RNC, which kicks off tonight, we're talking a lot about the battle for the suburbs, which is sort of, you know, we published a piece on the site by Tim Noah today saying, well, every election is a battle of the suburbs. It does tend to be a, you know, the cheap battleground, especially in these swing states. But it's, you know, I think everyone is expecting, just based on the announced speakers at the RNC, there is going to be this kind of unholy embrace of, you know, these culture war themes that Trump has already been, you know, hammering away at in his speeches and on Twitter about, you know, preserving the, you know, suburbs from fair house, you know, rolling back fair housing regulations and preserving a certain image of the suburbs that in many ways no longer exists. So I guess there are two questions here, you know, without going too far down the 2018, you know, strategy, which was to run a fairly safe economic message in suburban districts for the sake of picking up a majority in the House. You know, how are Democrats going to answer the sort of Republican charges that, you know, in the most extreme Trumpian formulation of it, that Joe Biden is going to destroy the suburbs. And secondly, you know, how is, you know, the messaging we've seen coming out of the DNC going to, you know, because for all the agita over the white working class, Trump also performed extremely well with suburban women in 2016, sort of to everyone's surprise. What, you know, beyond kind of his choice of a running mate, will the Democrats be able to do to, you know, continue to roll up gains in that critical constituency? Walter, you go.
Okay. Okay. One of the things, does anyone know if the bars are open in Pennsylvania? Because if there are, I am waiting for the first piece. Here in Western Pennsylvania, at Ernie's Pub, the Trump voters of 2016 still like Trump.
Yes, exactly.
Because as we all know, the press did nothing in 2012 other than go into Democratic areas and say, my God, Democrats still like Barack Obama. But the serious point is that one of the small alarming things is that I saw a poll this morning that said fear of crime has now ratcheted up as like the 5th most serious issue in America. Given, even with the pandemic related upsurge, crime levels are so much lower than they were in the 1990s or the first decade of the 21st century, that is a little bit of an alarming aspect, and the power of Trump's, oh my God, there's no one living in Portland other than crazy people who are burning down the city, sort of rhetoric. But the one other thing, 2 other real quick points. Number one, I have no intention of looking at any polls until September 1st, where I want both the reactions to both conventions to die down and the fact the last week in August is a terrible time to poll because even now too many people are traveling. But the other point is, in so many states, Republicans are used to voting by mail. Donald Trump has said it is safe to vote by mail in a state like Florida with a good Republican governor. But interestingly enough, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin all have Democratic governors. And I am fascinated how the Republicans will deal with, should you vote by mail if you live in a swing state when Donald Trump says that the Democrats will steal it? Because there are indications that a lot of Republicans are panicked about voting by mail, which, shall we say, is not the shrewdest political messaging by Donald Trump in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah, it is weird, and it's testament to how much Donald Trump really is the Republican Party now. That you know, he, you know, consistently, we were talking about this in an earlier meeting today, like, yeah, voting by mail was not a partisan issue. You know, it broke down pretty evenly until Trump made it one, and now Republicans are afraid to vote by mail. Similarly, he's, you know, now fixated on trotting out, you know, this blood plasma treatment for COVID on the eve of the convention, which is, you know, again, not the most reassuring messaging because it's not likely to materially affect the spread of the pandemic. And again, it is setting up this key over 65, you know, COVID vulnerable constituency for more disappointment or confusion. And it's hard at times to resist the notion that, you know, maybe Trump is getting paid off by the DNC at this point.
At least you can't bring blood plasma the same way you can drink bleach.
Yes, exactly. No, it will not be a hazard to.
Yeah, to Walter's point, we're doing a elections project at the Globe, and so I was in Florida last week for their primary, and there was an 87-year-old Cuban American gentleman who was like putting his wife's walker in the back of his minivan, and they had just gone to vote in person. They're Republicans because they were like, if we mail it, it's going to get stolen. Right. And the fraud and everything. And so it really felt like completely equally from Democrats and Republicans I talked to, they've been scared off by mail-in voting, the ones who showed up in person because of what Trump's been saying. It's like,
right. So yeah, it is, you know, I guess the other thing I wanted to ask, and Osita, you've written about this already, you know, in choosing Kamala Harris as his running mate, Biden has a VP candidate who's ripe for a lot of vicious Republican attacks, and we're going to see a lot of vicious attacks again over the course of the coming week. And you know, this is where I feel the worst kind of 2016 flashback. You know, if the Democrats' response to these kind of scorched earth attacks is, you know, we're compassionate, or when they go low, we go high, it makes me nervous. So I guess what, in your judgment, Osita, is the best counteroffensive? Is it to ignore it? Is it to you know, trot out yet more evidence of Republican corruption? What's the best tactic there?
Well, I don't think we've seen Trump. I mean, Trump has hit Harris, obviously. I don't think we've seen the worst of what we might expect from Trump on Harris yet. I think we're seeing some attacks on her personal history in conservative media. People like Rush Limbaugh, people like Trump's sons actually are sharing and promoting content on Twitter about Harris. So we'll see how that pans out. I mean, as Walter kind of said, I don't know if this election is real until like late September or October. That's when all guns are going to be blazing. But as far as whether those attacks will work, you know, I mean, they're playing into anxieties that worked for Trump in 2016. At the same time, as I wrote my piece about Harris, those are the kinds of attacks that also have pushed suburbanites and moderates away from Trump. That'll probably, you know, you can imagine them worsening his standing there in those constituencies and then backfiring that way. It's just hard to say. I mean, you know, this is just an election that's difficult to sort of game out and predict on multiple fronts. But I imagine that if Biden proves to be as invulnerable to Trump's attacks as he's been thus far, if Trump continues to fail to convince people that Joe Biden is a socialist or a communist or somebody who wants to let MS-13 into your neighborhood, whatever, now if that continues to fail, I think you're going to see more and more focus on Harris for the same, you know, demographic, cultural reasons that Trump leaned into that stuff in 2018 and 2016. It's just sort of his natural
I mean, Trump is comfortable and familiar attacking a woman, certainly.
Yeah, exactly.
And as well as a woman of color. All right, well, I foolishly at the outset of this neglected to mention that we have a Q&A, but we do, and fortunately our audience is smarter than me and submitted a couple of questions. So I wanted to spend the last 15 minutes here kicking those around. We have a question from Steve Kalish saying, why was the recent Senate report on confirming Russian collusion in 2016 met with such a collective yawn? Was it simply a case of been there, done that? There's nothing new to see here.
I think real quickly, and I will confess that in normal times, I would have read it a lot more in detail than skimming the news stories, that we are just dealing with collective, you know, just collective overload from
Right.
so many different fronts. And that I think the large extent is that at this point, anyone who is unconvinced of Russian collusion in the 2016 election and continuing Russian collusion and weird contacts between, the Daily Beast had one new piece out about Jared Kushner's connection to the person who is running one of the sovereign wealth funds in Russia. That basically, if you're not convinced now, you don't need new evidence. Basically, that you're just locked in your bubble and you will not hear it. But it's a really good question. And had this report come out 6 months ago, it probably would have had a bombshell effect.
Yeah, I mean, I think so much, the kind of failure of impeachment to result in a Senate conviction has created on the Republican side of things, Trump obviously feels a sense of impunity. He can sort of smash new norms and get away with anything. And I do think, there is a sense of, with everything else that's going on with the pandemic and the collapse of the economy, regrettably, I think a lack of attention to, what is an incredibly damning report. We have another question from Pat Heller asking, how much of an effect, if any, do you think the appearances of prominent Republican speakers during the DNC will have on undecided or wavering Republican voters? Anyone?
I'll be really quick since I've written this in the New Republic.
Okay.
I think it was really an important symbolic effort to have someone like John Kasich, a successful two-term Republican governor of Ohio, as a permission slip to Republican voters to appalled at Trump to vote for Biden. And I saw where Jeff Flake has just endorsed Biden for president. And fundamentally, I think going back to my first point, the point of a convention is to win votes. It's not to do anything else. And the bigger tent the Biden coalition has, the better off the Democrats are. And all the issues, one can disown the Never Trumpers on November 4th. But
they are.
But until November 3rd, I'm marching arm in arm with them.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that I would have liked the convention to make room for both John Kasich and Sherrod Brown. I do think there's a question of, with the Never Trumpers, we were making the point earlier that Osita, I think, made the point that the youth progressive vote doesn't matter all that much in a general election. And it's unclear to me how much the Never Trumpers represent a real political movement on the ground. I mean, they may well, and I'm with you, use every quiver in the bow, or I never get that metaphor right. Every arrow in the quiver. But it's unclear to me how, I did feel there was a certain piling on. Like once you get to Colin Powell, who I have trouble forgiving for his speech to the UN, with false intelligence about invading Iraq. But I do think, the enemy of our enemy. Cynthia Shallett has a question. You talk negatively about how progressives can push forward a progressive agenda. Can you give us some hope about how that could work, especially with the crisis of climate change? And she knows she's from California, where much of the state is presently on fire. Do we have the makings of a cohesive Green New Deal agenda beyond the level of lip service here in a Biden administration?
Well, I mean, I think that Biden has put forward climate policies that, you know, are fairly expensive. They're not anything like what Green New Deal advocates have put forward, but he's, you know, moved left on that issue. I don't know that I don't really think it's enough. And, you know, as I said at the beginning, what ultimately matters is what you can get through Congress, not what Biden puts on a piece of paper before the election.
Right.
I think that the main hope, as I said, has to come from progressive activism, pushing legislators. The only reason why anybody cares about the Green New Deal or knows what the Green New Deal is on a national level is because people after the midterms physically occupied Nancy Pelosi's office and made a demand about a Green New Deal committee that became a headline. And then we had this whole discourse about the Green New Deal and people figured out what it was. That's what it kind of takes. These protests that we've seen over the past few weeks across the country are driving local action on policing and already leading to some policy changes. Like these are the main mechanisms that progressives have available to them electorally, aside from winning primaries and
Right.
a few places with a lot of progressives. And those efforts should continue to happen. The biggest prospects for immediate change are going to come from what, you know, young progressive people have always had to lean on, just being loud and annoying in excess of their size in the electorate. That's what happened in the 60s, right? There was no.
And I do think, you know, we have seen, you know, I never would have thought, you know, the Joe Biden that we were seeing in the early primaries would have gone as far in the direction of addressing the climate crisis, of, you know, making at least it sound as though he's serious about wealth inequality. And I do think that is largely a function of, you know, pressure. And I think,
Yeah, I mean, Biden used to just tell people, "Don't vote for me then," which
right.
in the primary, that
Yeah,
was his favorite line. And now that's not, you don't hear that as much.
Yeah. It turns out he does want people to vote for him, which is a good thing. We have a question here from Norbert Hornstein asking, didn't Biden also win the under 45 Black and Hispanic vote, as well as the white progressive youth vote? Shouldn't these constituencies also matter?
I think he means Bernie. Didn't Bernie win the under 45 vote?
Oh, did I say Biden? Yes, he did say.
Yeah. And I think the answer,
that would be a scoop. So,
right. The answer to that question is yes. I mean, Sanders was not just the candidate of 18-year-olds and 20-somethings, but everybody in the Democratic Party under 45 or 50, which I think speaks to where the party is going. But when I say young progressives don't matter, I mean people who are very doggedly committed to progressive policy aims. There are people who like what Bernie Sanders had to say. There are people who ultimately voted for Bernie Sanders who are not all that mad about Joe Biden being the nominee.
Right.
When I say the young progressive vote, I mean people who are upset that Joe Biden is now the Democratic nominee, who have doubts about his presidency. That is not a very large constituency within the party or within the electorate. I think that one of the things that defined the primary was how much Democratic voters liked everybody, even if they chose a particular candidate or not, whether or not they supported Medicare for all. Everybody was basically okay with anybody being the nominee. People like me who are very cynical and jaded and angry and want to destroy everything, it's not a large constituency at all. And I think progressives should develop strategies with that in mind.
Right.
But, you know, I think that the party, you kind of have to hope that the party is going to continue to change and continue to get more serious on social welfare policy, on economic policy, on, you know, all of these other things. If not because that's where the electorate is, or the party is moving in terms of its voters, just because the party is running out of room to do anything else as far as centrist policy is concerned. They're kind of out of ideas. Third Way is not putting together large policy documents telling Biden what to do because we've tried all of that now.
Yeah.
And it hasn't really solved any real problems people have, so.
Could I just break in here and just say
Sure.
one reason for policy caution on the part of Biden and the people around him is that, frankly, no one knows the condition of the pandemic and the condition of the economy on January 20th, 2021. Right. And to make binding commitments that will then be overturned by events is to some extent a mistake Obama made in 2008 in underestimating the severity of the Great Recession. And the whole transition period was constantly upping the ante about how much stimulus the economy needed.
Right. Now, and the other reason to sort of hedge your bets until certainly after the election is, as we've been saying all along today, what's really dispositive in terms of getting policy enacted is Congress. So we need to know, is there a Senate majority for Democrats? Will the filibuster still be an albatross around the party's neck? So we need, obviously, there are many fronts on which Democrats do need to hold fire. But I do think Osita's larger point is true, that I think, the kind of inventory of centrist policy responses to crises like this has been kind of exhausted. I think, we did come out of 2008, not only with, not as big a stimulus as circumstances required, but there was no, in the sort of centrist let's move on mode, there was no effort to punish or jail bad actors in the 2008 crisis. I certainly would hope, this is a big question about Biden in my mind, whether there will be a real reckoning with, a previous administration that is a criminal conspiracy. You do actually have to, I think, make the rule of law mean something again in this country, if you're going to be a serious governing party, and that means going after a lot of people in the present administration. And I'm not sure the kind of undertow of as we saw in 2008, the kind of idea that that's all in the past. We're not going to prosecute the Bush administration for misdeeds in Iraq or over the Great Recession. Not the administration so much there as the financial sector. I do feel like, yes, that can be a divisive move, but I also think, and this is another thing that unfortunately we're running out of time, is like, we don't know how Trump is going to react if he is defeated at the polls, if there's going to be a disputed election, if there's going to be, the kind of militant QAnon wing of the Republican Party will, take their guns to state houses and fire this time. I mean, these are all real prospects. Well,
I think we should say that I think we do know how Trump is going to respond, which is that he is going to dispute the result of the election. Yeah. We saw him dispute after 2017 the result of an election he won. Right. Said that the Democrats did all this to run up the popular vote and so on. So I think it's a certainty that Trump is going to try to say, and is already saying, that there's massive mail fraud, the illegal immigrants voted, and all this kind of stuff. I don't know what kind of impact it has on the political system. I think that even in the best circumstances, even if Trump didn't do anything, even if mail voting worked without a hitch, it would still take us a while maybe to figure out who won the election. Which is not a situation we've faced in some time. I think it was Ben Smith of the New York Times wrote a piece about this the other day, about how the media needs to train itself to tell people, absolutely, we don't know who won, don't listen to rumors, blah, blah, blah. I don't know how much work like that is being done in newsrooms across the country, but I think that we should all be prepared for like an epistemic crisis in November. We won't necessarily know who won for a couple of weeks. Trump will be saying all kinds of stuff. And he won't, I've never taken the idea that he could stay in office if it is determined that he lost seriously. But I do think that he is going to try to question the results and sow chaos for as long as he can. And we should all be ready for that.
Yeah. I mean, if they don't know that by now, they haven't been paying attention. It's definitely true.
A tiny dissent. I'm going to gamble on a really depressed, almost silent Donald Trump post-election rather than a thundering. I just think it's going to be a balloon that deflates. I realize we're short on time, but I'm really curious, Liz, whether the Globe has taken any steps to deal with election week or election month in their coverage.
So we're doing a project, an elections project that is basically about this, just sort of gaming out like what could happen and preparing people for this very idea that it could take a really long time. That's why I was down in Florida, is to kind of talk to actual voters about like their fears and see how much the mail stuff has penetrated people's consciousness. And the answer is a lot. Like people already have these major doubts about this like form of voting that is perfectly safe. And so that's already kind of like it's honestly, it's a sad thing to see. And that's, you know, that damage I think is done. But we're trying to, you know, get as much like legitimate information to people and examine what's happening on that.
All right. Well, on that inspiring note, I want to really thank everyone. We've actually run over time. It was a great discussion, and I guess onward to the RNC. Thanks again.
Bye, thank you.
Yep.
Bye.
Have a good afternoon.